Welcome back to Rebuilders for 2022. What are we talking about today, Mark?
Well, we're looking ahead to 2022. The big issues. What does the pandemic look like? Is it going to burn out? Will it keep going in 2022? And are we heading towards the end of the pandemic, but the beginning of a new era of great power competition? What's with the massive Russian buildup surrounding Ukraine? How will this affect ordinary people? And how do we lead in increasingly ongoing disruptive times? That's what we're going to be looking at today.
Yes, it's a great episode. If you want to know more, want to hear what writers or articles have been referred to in the episode, you can subscribe to our mailing list by heading to rebuilders.co and subscribing there. Let's get into it. Well, welcome back to Rebuilders for 2022. My name's Liddy. I'm here with Mark Sayers and Daniel Merton. How are you guys?
Good. Happy New Year.
Yes, Happy New Year.
Merry Christmas.
Is it weird to say that when it's February?
Yeah.
Well, we're saying it to our listeners.
Yes, but it's
Who
still
we haven't
February.
seen this year.
No.
So we are wishing them.
I don't know that I saw many of them last year either.
Yeah.
No, we spoke to them.
Yes.
Very
spoke to them.
one-sided.
Yeah.
Yes. We sort of record in here, and then they have this weird experience of walking with, AirPods and hearing us in various places of the world.
Yeah. But thank you for listening,
Oh.
all of you out there. We hope you had a good summer/winter/ whatever weather you had in your respective locations.
Can I answer a question that I got a number of people send me messages?
Oh, yeah, go.
A lot of people asked, is Rebuilders coming back for 2022?
Oh. Tease
And
us.
what's the
Yes.
what's the answer?
Yes. We're back.
Excellent. It is good to be back. We, as always, had our behind-the-scenes chat pre-recording. And, there was
music.
there was music.
We had pastries again, which I'm stoked about. I feel like we'd kind of tapered off the pastry.
And I lost weight.
You lost weight.
Are you serious?
Yeah, through not eating pastries.
Through night. Congratulations.
Rebuilders is bad for your health.
But good
This year.
for your mind.
Yeah.
No, I feel like it's a good way to kick off the year, but maybe
What,
not a
pastries?
weekly.
Yeah. I think we were, as we've said before, I think we were coping with lockdown.
This was celebration pastries.
Yeah. Except they didn't have any savoury ones for me today from where I ordered. So I had a brownie, which wasn't a pastry, and it was very sugary.
Yeah.
Delicious.
Yeah.
But anyway. So, there's our pastry rundown. I'm sure you've missed it. Shall we dive in?
Let's dive in.
Okay, let's dive in. So if you're new to listening to us, we kind of speak to leaders in a variety of different contexts across the world. Mark, your reservoir of knowledge about what? We're diving in. There's a reservoir of knowledge.
Is
I'm
there a
extending
dam?
a metaphor.
Is there a dam of the reservoir?
There's a small puddle. Small dirty puddle.
I'm sticking with a reservoir. Anyway, so we, I guess, look at what is happening in culture, what is happening globally, and how that filters down into, I guess, church contexts and contexts that people are leading in, acknowledging that what is going on in the world does affect each and every person in the world in a variety of different ways. So I guess that's what we're kind of aiming to do as a big picture. But today we're going to talk about some big ticket items that happened across the last couple of months, right?
Yes. It is a funny old podcast.
It's a funny old podcast.
It's a funny old podcast in the sense of, it is funny just thinking about it sorry, as you're speaking, I know you're about to take us into today's episode.
Oh,
but
no,
it
that's
is,
okay. I can
it
do
is
that.
a weird thing where it's like, it's sort of a Christian leadership podcast, talking about church life, but then geopolitics, culture. But that's sort of what this moment is, isn't it? It's
yeah. It's the macro and micro and the way that those things intersect, right?
Yes. And I think news is happening so quickly and can pour down into your context where you're leading so rapidly that even just us not speaking between now and the end of last year, there's all this stuff that's happened.
I'm literally like sending you text messages.
Yeah.
What's happening? What's your read on this?
And I was losing weight actually from the stress of those text messages over the break. Yeah. No.
So I guess, in a time that can be quite disorienting and quite alarming giving voice to and having strategies to read the news, read what's happening in culture, is really vital to leading. So I guess, we always come back to the pandemic, or that's what we've been doing for the last couple of years because it's still happening. Where are we at? Where are we at with the pandemic? What's going on?
Well, obviously, when did we record our last episode?
I think it's the 24th of November.
24th of November, on the eve of Omicron.
Very cusp of it.
And
Well, for us here.
Yeah, well, I think it's sort of around the world. It sort of emerged in South Africa and then in Gauteng province, and then went to Denmark and England. It's sort of all over the world now. I think I saw a thing today. It was 99.9% of cases in the US or something crazy like that today.
Really?
So
Wow.
it's rapidly overtaken Delta. And obviously, different variants. I think I actually did an early record for Carrie Newhoff's show and talked about, what if there's another variant? We don't know what's coming. I think that was released in January. So that concept that often the rules of the game change very quickly when new variants happen. The pandemic doesn't stay the same. And I think Omicron's done that. So Omicron has been highly transmissible. It's less severe, but there's some nuance needed with less severe. Often it's spoken about as mild, but what people mean by that is it's more mild than Delta, which had added severity.
Yep.
But I think the sort of latest data is that it's probably more severe than the first. I think they call it the wild strain is the term used of the first sort of strain that came out of the beginning of 2020. And, it's just rapidly gone around the world. And I think, for Australia, our sort of strategy was to get to, highly vaxxed and then sort of open up in this vaccinated economy in the sense because vaccines had good protection against severe illness and death.
Yep.
But Omicron has enabled, had some vaccine escape as well. So it means lots of people have got it. And so it's cut through previous infection and, vaccines in terms of transmissibility. And what it's meant really, it's meant a couple of things. I think in countries that are highly vaccinated, particularly well into their booster program, I think about us here, I think about, Denmark and some of the Scandinavian nations and the UK. You've had stacks and stacks of cases, far more than we're ever used to. And there's been a disruptive element to that. But many people experience it in a mild form, particularly those who've been boosted. And you're not seeing the same linkage between people getting cases and death and even ICU. And there's some different ways that Omicron affects, they think higher up in the respiratory system than sort of lower in the lungs. So in a sense, it's been this hugely disruptive thing with people sort of having to furlough and take time off work and isolate and so on. It's having a different effect in other countries which are less vaccinated, and thinking particularly of Eastern Europe and the United States, which has got lower. I think the US just has been posting. I think it was like 17,000 deaths in the last week or something. So it's still doing significant damage in places, but you've sort of almost got this sort of you can begin to see the future a little bit. With high vaccine coverage and particularly booster programs. I heard one interesting, analysis of it, like looking forward. And I think this is a really helpful way of understanding how to predict. This person, when asked about what does the future hold in 2022 for the pandemic, said there's really three options. And I thought that's really good. I think in the past it used to be like, this is what it's going to look like, and we bet everything on that. They had three.
We know how well that turned out.
Exactly. They had three forecasts. One was the clear skies forecast, which is where Omicron, with its high transmissibility, burns around the world at a really rapid rate, giving people some immunity for those who aren't vaccinated, and people who are vaccinated even more immunity. And in a sense that sort of, it burns itself out, effectively, because it's just so transmissible. And that happens. So you get this big peak and then it sort of disappears. They then offered the second option, which is the dark sky option, which is the emergence of another variant. For another variant to emerge, it would have to have high transmissibility to be able to outpace and outcompete Omicron, some vaccine escape as well, and then increased severity. So that's a sort of nightmare scenario. You get something that has the transmissibility of Omicron, and with some of the vaccine escape and the severity of an even worse Delta.
Yes.
So that's the situation. Can you write that situation off? No. Just because we don't want it to happen doesn't mean it's not going to happen. The third option they gave was the cloudy skies option, which was the idea that Omicron will sort of be here. It'll come in waves and peaks. And, like in Australia, you might have this big peak and then it sort of disappears and comes back in winter. Similar thing in the Northern Hemisphere, that it may move around cities and places like that. There's a sense that it's reached peak on the Eastern Australian seaboard. Similar things being said about the US Eastern seaboard and the American Eastern seaboard. And then it could, appear in another part of the country or move from this city. So it sort of goes in and out, but effectively it's sort of contained through boosters, increased therapeutic drugs, which are now available in the market. And as more people around the world become vaccinated, it sort of becomes this thing we manage, but still manage to do some disruption and some sort of devastation through continuing of taking lives. So that's sort of three options, I think, going forward. Which one's going to happen? I don't know.
Yeah. Just a question, you may not know the answer to this, but that cloudy skies option, is that kind of when it moves from a pandemic to endemic?
Yeah.
It's like you're living with it, it's present in society, but it's not like running rampant.
Yeah. So there's a lot of talk, obviously, about living with the virus and endemic, and a lot of that really comes down to what is a sense where a level of death that actually. So there's a lot of talk about hospitalization. So you've obviously got part of the pandemic you've got to see systematically where what's the point where it begins to overrun the hospital systems.
Yes.
And Omicron did that through its sheer numbers. While in a sense there's greater mildness, if you'd rather have a so I think SARS 1, I think it was like the SARS that came before COVID, had a really high severity rate. Like it was really bad, but had much lower transmissibility. So you'd rather something like that, which only a few people get, even though it kills more, than you want something where it just infects most of the world.
Yes.
So you'd rather have you'd rather have a bigger number of a smaller number than a small number of a bigger number, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
There's a sense where, there's questions that, society has to ask, what's the level of, once we understand, or the burden of the hospital system is not there, what's the level of death that a society, is willing to live with? So obviously, I think in Australia, I think I read it was between 500 and 1,000 people die of flu every year. Obviously, more people are dying from COVID at this point in time. There's an element where society accepts that level of death with flu, as much as that is terrible. So in a sense, you sort of live with, and so people sort of saying we're moving from a pandemic to an endemic stage.
Yes, yeah.
Issue with that is, there's a lot of diseases that, were endemic at times, TB and smallpox and this, which needed to be wiped out. So there's an element that endemic doesn't mean it's just become the common cold. So it still will present an ongoing threat.
Yes.
And endemic can then spark back into pandemics. So if you look at, the bubonic plague, which plagued Europe, the stages where it was in pandemic and then it sort of disappeared and sort of endemic means it's somewhere in the world at that time.
Yeah, okay.
So it was endemic and then it would sort of burst off again. So
well, it wiped out a third of Europe.
It's staggering when you read about the bubonic plague and kept coming back for centuries.
Yeah. I do wonder, thinking about, what's our perspective as Christians being like, are we okay with, people dying? What's our view in response to, are we willing to, live with this present in our society?
Yeah, I mean, there's several different, I think things to hold together. One is, what does it mean to be a Christian and understand that death is part of life and that suffering is part of life. And, in a sense, we, cancer is prevalent, in our society.
Absolutely.
And, other heart disease and so on. There's an element that, we live under the curse of disease and death, in this world. The second element is, also we're called to be people of, life and resurrection, and, how do we also, pursue I'm glad I live in a society which has eradicated things like smallpox and TB and, that I'm not worrying. People used to, I think my grandfather's family, he had something like 11 or 12 brothers and sisters, and that was quite normal because people expected to lose a number of children.
Yeah,
that's why people had bigger families, it was like an insurance policy.
Yeah.
I'm glad I don't live in that world.
Yeah.
And I'm glad of the advance of medical science. And many of those people were, Christian doctors and scientists, and, advancing. So I think, Christians pursuing that. I think that the third element too is, I think one thing that, the whole pandemic has raised is how do we protect the vulnerable?
Yeah.
And I think the church, whether that be people who are immunocompromised, people who are working in frontline jobs, the way that, the pandemic has disproportionately affected those who are from lower incomes, in certain places, Indigenous or, people of color in different countries, how do we as Christians deal with the systemic element of a pandemic as well?
Yeah.
I think we're used to seeing things through an individualistic lens, and people still see that. But I realized that I can work from home and order Uber to my door and order my groceries. There's people who have to be on front line. So how do we? I think it raises a number of questions and reveals things. James Meeks, the British novelist, I think it was in the London Review of Books, said something of shutdowns and lockdowns. He said, when the pandemic first comes, he said, when you stop moving, you may start to see how things really are. I think was the quote.
Yeah.
And I think there's an element of that where, this is illuminated again, the world. And we saw even in Australia, people like Tom Hanks and stuff flying in and out of the country. And Julia Roberts was like living in Sydney, and there was all these like Hollywood people who turned up when Australia had COVID zero and, other countries, so you sort of.
Pretty sure Zac Efron lives here now.
Zac Efron. George Clooney was living here. There was just like all these bizarre thing where they're just spotting all these Hollywood celebs living in Sydney and Byron Bay. But again, it shows how you've got people who are poor, unable to move, and you've got people who are rich, able to just even in a pandemic, able to sort of move around and get through the cracks, and quarantine in large estates somewhere, because they pay for guarantees. So I think all Christians have to hold all those things together.
Yeah. Pandemic. Anything more to kind of say on that, or Daniel, do you have any questions about what's ahead for the pandemic?
No.
Nah, that's fine. Well, you know what? I think it's time to move on to one of your favorite topics.
Favorite topics.
Russia.
Is that, I feel like is that a Russian accent?
I feel like I've been.
No, I just felt like rolling my R.
I feel like I've been mischaracterized in many spaces as some kind of.
Mark, we know that you've got a passion for Russia.
I've got a passion for lots of places in the world.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. I think probably because
it's a fascinating country, though.
Oh, Russia's a fascinating country.
Fascinating.
I've always wanted to go to St. Petersburg.
Yeah, me too.
One day.
Me too.
The Venice.
Shall we go on a road trip?
Rebuild its road trip.
Rebuild its road trip. Live from St. Petersburg.
Excellent. Coming to
put
you
that on our
next month.
Put that on our wish board.
Our wish board.
Do you have a wish board?
Along with
Do we have a wish board?
We need to now.
Yeah, okay. We'll work on that.
Bedazzled headphones be on the wish board?
They can be on yours.
It's on it.
Well, no, genuinely, Russia. Obviously, over, when's it been? The last month or so, there's really been a lot of news about will Russia invade Ukraine. To be honest, I have not delved very deep into this story.
Yeah.
So I would love to understand it, love to understand how, like, what's actually happening. Could we be entering World War III?
Yeah. Out of the pandemic, Omicron. We got the sunny skies thing, and then Omicron burns out the pandemic, and then are we in World War III? Can I just bring up a point which I was pondering about this subject?
Go on.
Which is, why do people say the Ukraine? Like, where does that come from?
Did I just say that?
I don't think you did, but you do hear that. Like, you hear that, like, and I think of the Seinfeld episode where they're playing Risk. And there's the guy on the subway who's like, the Ukraine is strong. Remember that episode?
What season is that in?
Newman and Kramer are playing Risk.
Yeah.
And they want to keep the game going. So they take it on the subway. And then they're like, Kramer's like sort of trash talking Newman, like, the Ukraine is weak. The Ukraine's about crushed. And then there's a Ukrainian guy standing next to him and gets angry and smashes the board.
See, I don't remember that.
Spoiler alert.
If Ukraine is a game to you? Is that the line?
Yes, yes.
What season?
I'm Googling.
You
Okay.
Google.
You
We'll
Google.
keep
Let us
going.
know when you know.
But
I'm a little bit wounded inside that I can't remember when that is.
I know.
Season 6, episode
Season
12.
6.
The Label
Season
Maker.
6.
The label
Oh,
maker.
the label maker.
Yes. Where they falls off. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Why do people say the Ukraine? Like no one says the Australia. Did you go to the China?
I'm sure there's a reason.
But it's wrong. Like it's wrong.
Yeah, but what if it's not? How do you know that?
No,
it's
it's
wrong?
not because a constant throughout following this story, you constantly see people on Twitter like, Eastern Europe political specialists like, please stop saying the Ukraine. Like, why do people say the Ukraine?
It's actually the Ukraine. This is Get of Wikipedia. The Ukraine used to be a frequently used form in English throughout the 20th century. But since the Declaration of Independence of Ukraine in 1991, the Ukraine has become less common in the English-speaking world. And style guides warn against its use in professional writing.
But does it explain why during that period of time?
Is that because it's a region? So when it was part of the Soviet Union, it was seen as a region.
Yeah, maybe.
Yes.
Even though
yes,
technically I think that was sort of like countries within Soviet republics within.
Or like the Crimean Peninsula or something
yes,
like that.
the Crimea, yes.
Yeah.
Or you might say, they said the Donbass, which is part of eastern Ukraine. Or you might say the Riviera in France.
Yeah.
So it's more of a
So it's a region, but then it became a
area
nation.
of land.
Yes.
Maybe we'll
We've cracked it. We've cracked it.
Well, we probably have. I'll
Yeah.
do a little bit more research
Yeah.
before we record our subscriber chat. So if you
Yes,
are a
yes.
subscriber,
have the
you
answer.
can you can find out then. If you're not a subscriber, you can become one by going to rebuilders.co and subscribing there.
Okay, so
Russia,
Ukraine.
not the Ukraine, just Ukraine.
So currently we have quite a serious situation in Ukraine, not the Ukraine, where you have a significant buildup of Russian forces surrounding the country of Ukraine. So obviously Russia and Ukraine were both Soviet republics within the USSR, the United Soviet Republics. That was the former Soviet Union.
Yep.
And obviously with the breakup of the USSR, both Russia and Ukraine became independent countries. One of the things that happened during that, which is really key, is that both, because the Soviets had placed nuclear weapons throughout the Soviet Union, that both countries had significant nuclear weapons.
Okay.
And
This is early 90s, right?
This is early 90s. And some of the Western powers came in, and what there was a real concern of you had all these countries which then, broke up into a number of countries. And then what you didn't want to have, or what the Western powers didn't want to have, is all these smaller countries to have nuclear weapons, because what if there's a dispute and it just becomes this mini nuclear war? So Ukraine was convinced to hand over its nuclear weapons, and I think they gave them back to Russia. But there was sort of argued, and they would sort of argue today, or some would, that part of the proviso was that therefore they gave them up, but they would want the West to protect them if there ever was Russian aggression.
Okay.
And then in 2014, I think, can I get a fact check on that? You had this incursion into Ukraine by what first appeared to be little green men, they were called, which were these soldiers wearing no markings.
Yes, yeah.
Who were not talking, which took a number of places, and there was different areas in eastern Ukraine. Crimea and the Donbass and parts of Ukraine had Russian-speaking minorities. So there's been a sort of ongoing now frozen conflict is the term used, where Ukraine in a sense lost control of parts of its own country, and there's sort of separatists there being backed by the Russian military.
Yep.
Initially, the Russians denied that they were there, but eventually Vladimir Putin sort of said that they were there. So there's sort of been a frozen conflict. But then what happened, I think, sort of at the end of last year, is that there began to be this significant troop buildup of Russian troops not only sort of on the Russian-Ukraine border, but also in Belarus. So we had, I think it was last year, was it? There was the sort of attempted revolution in Belarus with its sort of long-term leader, many would say dictator, Lukashenko, and it looked like Russia sort of saved him. And there has been talk of some time of a sort of union between Belarus and Russia. So effectively, to sort of cut to the chase, what you have now is you have upwards of what's estimated to be 200,000 troops, Russian troops, on the border with Ukraine. And this has caused huge concern throughout Europe and in sort of NATO. So what NATO is, for those who don't know, is that NATO was a treaty organization, an alliance of North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Yep.
Different European countries who from Western Europe, but also the United States and Canada. And really they were seen as a military bulwark against what they were concerned was the expansion of communism, and particularly the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc or the Warsaw Pact. So effectively what we have today is we have this huge troop buildup, and there's real concern that this will then head into a war. There's been intelligence leaked from the United States and United Kingdom that Russia intends to take the whole of Ukraine and occupy Kiev. It's interesting that the Ukrainians are sort of saying, this is actually not the case. So you've got the sort of Ukrainians saying that the Western powers are freaking out a little bit, but then Ukraine is preparing. So this is the first time. This is probably, many people saying this is the sort of most significant threat in Europe for decades.
Yeah, okay.
And if you were to have a land war between Russia and Ukraine, it would possibly draw in other people. So it would draw in other NATO forces. Now, part of the argument from the Western side is that Russia has been aggressive and has gone into Ukraine, it's gone into places like Syria and so on. And this is sort of the unchecked power of, Vladimir Putin. His regime is seen as authoritarian. And there's this deep concern that there's a sort of new axis in the world of Russia, China, places like other countries like Iran, Venezuela, sort of creating this pact against sort of Western liberal democracies. And particularly the concern really is part of China and Russia. The sort of Russian argument would be that when the Soviet Union fell, why do they need to have NATO? Why do they need to have this organization which was designed to push back on Russia? And Russia felt that it had agreements that NATO wouldn't go any further eastward.
Yeah.
But there's been a number of countries in Eastern Europe which have joined NATO, and there's been some talk that Ukraine was wanting to join NATO. So they, in a sense, see themselves also being sort of pushed towards. So you've got this tremendous sort of high stakes game. My sense is that Russia won't attack. I could be wrong, but to actually take a huge country like Ukraine to occupy it. We just saw the huge military cost the US has incurred in the world's biggest army, richest country, in occupying Afghanistan and Iraq, which they've withdrawn from. And for Russia, has learnt from that to go into occupy a country which would, many people would want to be engaged in a sort of guerrilla warfare against. It would be really damaging and have a huge cost, both in terms of, loss of life and also economic consequences for Russia, and also popular opinion at home at a time when there has been a sort of growing protest movement taking place against Russia, particularly since the imprisonment of the opposition figure Alexei Navalny. Now, with this news, it's always really key to try and analyze it, and I think ask what's the sort of signal in the midst of all the noise. And my sense is that there's a bigger story going on. I don't think Russia is going to invade. Now, things can always go wrong.
Yeah.
We've seen huge wars start when there's misunderstandings. All you need is someone who's trigger happy or someone to accidentally shoot down a plane or whatever, and very quickly emotions can take over and disaster befalls disaster, and you find yourself cascading into war, which could draw in Belarus, it could draw in Poland, it could draw in Sweden, Finland, so many other countries, plus NATO countries and so on around. My sense is that actually what Russia is doing is testing the West. Russia doesn't want to have a country which is seen as moving towards becoming Western and liberal on its doorstep. So this is actually sort of like high stakes trolling. And if you think about politics in many ways in the world, it's become a game of trolling. Whether it be tweets, you saw Donald Trump tweeting, and you now got Chinese government officials who are like trolling the West and doing all this sort of crazy stuff. And in a sense, this is almost real world trolling. I think that by surrounding and putting these troops there, you're not doing anything. You get a lot of leverage. Part, I think, of the Russian concern was that under the Obama administration, the US had started Indo-Pacific pivot, seeing that the real challenge to the US was actually not in Europe, that actually it was China, and they needed to move their forces and their attention to the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And in a sense, this is Russia, sort of doing something to get attention back. But I also think what this speaks of is, you've got now the danger for the US is to be stretched and to have to have a focus in both Europe and the utter nightmare scenario would be that Russia goes into Ukraine at the same time that China goes into Taiwan.
Okay.
Because it'd be very difficult for the US to fight on two fronts and be hugely stretched. I think also Russia sees weakness at this time in Europe. It sees Angela Merkel passing, who was in a sense, many ways, sort of leader of Europe and push back on the Russians at times. But, the effect of coronavirus on places like the UK and the US and throughout Western Europe, the economic sort of unknown waters that the West finds itself in, and just a sense of polarization in the West. I think this is Russia, who's now in a strategic alliance with China, really pushing the West. But the big analysis in all of this is the West is now being tested, and the direction that we thought the world would head in of just eventual Western dominance of a sort of liberal, democratic, secular world order is really being tested at this point in time. And, things, again, just like the pandemic, that we didn't think we would see again in terms of science. Haven't we, dealt with all that stuff? How could a small virus sort of shut down, a large part of the world? Things like war and conflict. We're moving into, what I've talked about, and perhaps we'll talk about more this year with my book coming out, Grey Zone.
Yep.
That this is now a grey zone moment where we've moved from the solidity of the post-World War order, post end of the Soviet Union world order into now uncharted areas, and everyone's testing each other out. They're sort of like seeing where things lay. And I think what we're going to see is the world sort of move into these blocks where you've got people who are aligned with China, and the sort of China-Russia bloc with the sort of US bloc with the EU bloc and so on. So we're entering into a new stage of geopolitical conflict.
Can you do you have any other examples of where that's sort of emerging? I know you were talking earlier about Burma. You've done some reading over the break, or do you want to go there today?
We'll do Burma. We'll do Burma. We'll do Burma another week.
Okay, right. I've thrown out the bait and you've thrown it back. That's totally fine.
Well, I can give other examples. Sure. So you're seeing things like you had Western brands that were dominant in the world. Increasingly, you're seeing Chinese, Korean brands dominate in the world. Okay. In China is in many ways disconnecting itself. We were just reading before of a news article we were talking about as we're getting ready of a young American skier who was going to represent, as a medal favorite, in the Winter Olympics, Elaine Gu, who had just signed a bunch of modeling contracts. Was going to be this face, has a Chinese mother, she's from San Francisco, but never lived in China, has just chosen to not represent America but represent China. Yeah. And sort of the language of, well, that's where the economy is now, that's where the growth is now. And I thought that's really interesting, a sort of sign of how people are looking, where's the next rising power versus the sort of fading power. So if you think about so much of how we view the world has been shaped by, we talked about here before, is by that world order that, really was the American century. Yes. And it's shifting now. We've talked a lot about that, but this is happening now with real hardware. This is just not ideological stuff. This is sort of tanks on the ground showing how the world order is really changing. And, Andrew Breitbart, the American conservative commentator who died of a heart attack a few years ago, he used to say, politics is downstream from culture, My addition to that is culture is downstreams from geopolitics.
Yeah, okay.
So, the culture of other countries as they come into different orbits, whether it's, China or Russia or the US, whatever, it's going to change. So these geopolitical effects will have changes in the world as the world starts to rearrange a new power arrangement.
So as leaders in myriad contexts, how could we expect to see that filtering down? Do you have any ideas about what to look out for?
Yeah. Well, I think again too, the idea was that the secular liberal democratic order, and by secular I don't mean no one believes in God, but rather this idea that religion, identity, nationalism would be held back from the public square.
Yeah.
And really what the public square was about was commerce. That was really the idea. The idea was the world's going to become a giant mall, and China will trade with America, and no one's going to really talk about these big issues of identity. Yeah, you can have your little religious faith there in that private sphere, and you can be proud of your cultural background, but keep it over there, or don't do it in a way that tests my
yes.
Eat your local cuisine. But where we're now moving to is actually a much more contested space.
Yeah.
And so a contested space is really the paradigm shift that we're moving into. And what that means is the idea of having one dominant sort of cultural voice at the top dictating everything, that's shifting. Again, this is decentralization. We're moving from one central idea which determines everything to many competing voices. So things to look out for, the idea that if you're in if there is these big conflicts do kick off, what does that mean in countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US, Kingdom, where you might have people in your churches who are on different sides of those conflicts through their ethnic ancestry, and might see things very differently, that people have seen the culture war stuff and they've understood that through a left or right dynamic. How do you do the people of God when you've got these flashpoints that are expanding? So I think before we've seen, people have understood, the flashpoints in churches between left and right. What happens when that expands into different, even a bigger scope of identities?
I guess that's that from a complicated world to a complex world,
right? Yes, totally. And so, again, too, I think this is going to be increased disruption. And so the big key, and I think this is going to be a focus of what we're going to talk about and read because this year, is we have to change how we lead. We can't just assume that the environment's going to stay the same. We have to learn to lead in a more dependent way upon God. We need to look at, how you think about Jesus's discipleship community.
Yeah.
He had people who were his ministry to people, ex-tax collectors. You had people who were, zealots, these sort of political radicals, how did he hold together this group who was so different, and then the early church represented that. And so I think that's going to get a lot more real for us going forward. And I think the methods of the past where you provide people a good program, give them a good car, parking, and they'll come and, great sound system and, worship singers who can sing on key, and a life applicational sermon. I'm not saying any of those things are wrong in of themselves, but I think that very sort of just like big box mentality is going to struggle. And I think increasingly leadership is going to help people be the people of God in the midst of these contested spaces. Yeah,
well, I mean, it's going to be an interesting year ahead.
Yes.
Talking about this stuff. Thank you so much, Mark, for leading us through that and helping us start to grasp some of what is going to be impacting our many contexts this year. It's a pleasure to be back.
It is good to be back.
Yeah. So until next time, this has been Rebuilders.